mechanistic pathways to process heme iron versus non-heme iron completely different. I did not know that. And so what's the most efficient form of iron? Animal protein, because it's already in the state that the body can work with it. And so all of this foment about non-heme iron coming from supplement bottles, coming through a dietary system, which is only 5% of the iron that we need each day, and ignoring the 95% coming from a recycling system that's already got the iron in the state that it needs to be in. That's where the gross distortion is in physiology, not knowing that those two systems, there's dietary and recycled iron, heme and non-heme iron, and it's like, oh my gosh. And they intersect in very powerful ways. And the public doesn't know that, and the practitioners don't know that. And so that's where I think these types of conversations are so important, to give people a real clear understanding that it isn't that complicated, but we're being restricted about what we can learn to really take control.
Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Sara, and today's guest is Morley Robbins, back for the fourth time. In this episode, Morley discusses the complicated interactions of minerals in the body, with particular focus on copper, iron and zinc, as well as how people misinterpret HTMA and blood tests when measuring zinc and copper levels. I asked Morley to explain copper toxicity and invisible copper toxicity in detail, because I've heard this thrown around the internet a lot. Morley also goes back over vitamin A again, because that's again something that's been demonized, along with things like cholesterol. Morley also goes over his new discoveries of how iron and heme are processed in the mitochondria, and he also discusses the really important difference between heme iron and non-heme iron, because this has huge implications, particularly if people use things like iron supplements or have iron and copper dysregulation. To support the channel, please check out my Substack. It has a wide range of articles on quantum biology, but also other things like peptides and also deuterium and nutrition. I've just made an affordable new course called the Quantum Starter Kit, Energy and Mitochondria from the Ground Up. This is based on feedback that I've been getting that people are finding quantum health and even nutrition and biology in general just massively overwhelming, especially when there's new language like deuterium, electrons, redox, all sorts of things. So this course is a beginner's guide to optimizing your biology using water, light, magnetism, charge and nutrition. And like I said, it's $19, so it's very affordable for people who want to learn more about this subject. This course also comes free if you join my membership group, because it'll help you get up to speed with what we talk about and discuss there. The links are in the description. Welcome back to the channel, Morley, for the fourth time. So we've got lots in stall today, and you've learned a whole lot of new things. But I think to carry on from our series that we've been doing, I'd like to open with this thing called invisible copper toxicity that keeps coming up. And we just discussed it very briefly, and I wanted to make sure that the viewers didn't miss out, because we could easily talk for an hour and not record anything. So do you want to dive in and shed light on this invisible copper toxicity situation?
Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here again, and thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. The properties of iron and copper are very different, or strikingly different, in the blood versus the tissue. And what you find is that when iron often shows low in the blood, it's accumulating in the tissue. And that's a crisis, another hidden crisis, because the low iron in the blood is perceived as anemia, and people are given more iron, when in fact, no, the body's not recycling the iron. That's where the challenge is, due to a lack of copper, I might add. But the presentation of copper is just the opposite. It will show high in the blood, when in fact it's low in the tissue. And I just had verification of that just this morning. One of my colleagues, Gillian Crowther, based in London, does work with a German lab, and they're able to look at the mineral composition inside the cell, but also inside the mitochondria. And what they find is that people who present with high serum copper are in fact showing low copper in the cell and in the mitochondria, which is the complete opposite of what people perceive of with this so-called copper toxicity. I think what we have to do as we explore this is ask a very simple question. If 95% of the copper in the blood is supposed to be bound to ceruloplasmin, and that number goes back to the 40s, and it's carried forward. There's some authors or some scientists who would argue it could be as low as 70%. But the majority of clinicians and scientists who really have familiarity with ceruloplasmin would say that the number should be closer to 95%. So if the vast majority of copper is supposed to be bound to this master antioxidant protein, the question that needs to be asked is, why did copper come out of the protein? What destabilized, what denatured ceruloplasmin to allow this release of copper? It turns out there's a key tyrosine amino acid. I've forgotten the number, but there's one tyrosine that's the trapdoor, and when it gets oxidized, all the coppers come out like diarrhea, literally. And so there are chemical mechanisms that will open up that trapdoor. Ascorbic acid is one of them. Antibiotics is another. There are other citric acid, synthetic citric acid will do the same thing. It's known as the citric acid is known as the endogenous inhibitor of ceruloplasmin. So people may not be aware of that side of this dynamic, but there's actually two questions that need to be asked. One, why is the copper coming out? What triggered the event? But the second question is that copper being used by the immune system? And lo and behold, it is. It's the neutrophils rely on copper-2 to do their work. And so there's this gross perception of, we have copper toxicity, when in fact, that's the genius of the body saying, well, in order to activate the properties of the neutrophils, which are the marines of the immune system, they're the first ones in, they need to be working with this oxidized form of copper, which is fascinating to think about because the copper-2 has been demonized, when in fact, it's just Mother Nature's way of activating the immune system. So I think there's this swirling gap of understanding about the properties of copper that are fueling this misperception of copper is toxic. There's a lot of literature now about copper causing oxidative stress. It causes the Fenton reaction. Yeah, that's possible, but we have to get to orders of magnitude. There's at least 50 to 100 times more iron in the body than there is copper, but somehow there's teams of scientists that will artfully blame copper for what clearly has to be an iron issue. And there's a lot of confusion around that, as you know. And then I think there's just this just vacuous understanding about what is the role of ceruloplasmin in the body. The analogy that my buddy Ben Edwards, who's a physician in Lubbock, Texas, loves to use is of the Swiss Army knife. When you get it, people will recognize that logo. So when we're doing a blood test for copper and ceruloplasmin, we know how much copper there is in the serum, and we know how many. Let's pretend this Swiss Army knife represents ceruloplasmin. We know how many Swiss Army knives there are in the blood. What we're not allowed to know is what's the functionality of that Swiss Army knife. Turns out this particular brand of Swiss Army knife has 32 functions. And that's a lot of functions. It turns out that ceruloplasmin, I'm up to 27 functions now. 27 different substrates that ceruloplasmin works with. It isn't just iron. See, that the literature would tell you that, let's pretend the knife blade is ferrooxidase. And that's what ceruloplasmin does. No, it actually does 31 other things, but we're not allowed to measure those. We can measure, in research studies, they can tell you the ferrooxidase activity, but only in research studies. We can't use it in general clinical medicine. We can't use it in any kind of forward-thinking health improvement, because it would kill the business model of big pharma. Because if you know what the ceruloplasmin activity is, if you know what ferrooxidase is doing, you would know whether there's an iron problem. And again, the meme that runs medicine, at least as I've pieced it together, is that you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And we're here talking about the copper toxic side of it, but the predecessor issue is you're anemic and you need to take more iron. I was just talking to a colleague over in your neck of the woods, your home neck of the woods, and she's been anemic her whole life. The phrase that she used, Sara, is, "I have suffered with anemia most of my life." Listen to those words. I have suffered with anemia. And I said, do you realize what you just said? She said, well, yeah. I said, it's a very negative phrase. I have suffered. So I said, so then you perceive you're broken. And she said, well, that's kind of how it feels. When she was pregnant with her third child, she took 100 milligrams of iron every day. That's 3 months worth of iron every day. Because we only need 1 milligram of iron through our mouth. The other 24 milligrams are supposed to come from our recycling system. And so people don't know about the reticuloendothelial system, the recycling side, which is the 95% of iron needed for everyday use. And we're only supposed to get a very small percentage from our diet. But she's getting 3 months worth every day. And she's actually doing okay. But she's breastfeeding her third child now. And she's struggling. And so it's just like, now she knows why. And so it's just this misperception of, within the practitioner community, across all branches of it, have been trained that all forms of low iron, whether it's hemoglobin, ferritin, or serum iron, all forms of low iron are solved by one solution, more iron. And that's just not the case. And it's like when you have a car that breaks down and it turns out it's a flat tire, or it turns out that windshield wipers aren't working, or it turns out your battery is dead, and you go to the gas station and they say, well, you need more gas. No, I've got a flat tire. No, you need more gas. That's what's happening with this in the world of clinical medicine, is that all forms of low iron are being treated with the same solution. But the complication is copper is misunderstood, and it's misrepresented in the blood work because people aren't trained in the nuance of how copper can look high in the blood, but it's actually low in the tissue. And that there are very few labs, other than what Jillian's talking about over in Germany, that can peek inside the cell to find out what's really going on with the mineral dynamics inside the cell and inside the mitochondria. So I think the phrase is, people would rather believe a simple lie than the complex truth. I've been talking now for about 12 minutes, and it takes a long time to explain what copper toxicity is about, right? It isn't a simple, follow this logic and you'll be fine, because there's so much misunderstanding about the role of copper in the body. And I think it's a convenient excuse to blame copper because it hides the real problem, which I think is iron accumulation causing increased oxidative stress inside the tissue, whether it's inside the cell or inside the mitochondria. We can have quite a discussion about that. But I think the mainstream practitioner doesn't take the time to think it through. And certainly the public is just, they're going to parrot whatever they're told because they're not going to take the time to do the research. So that's my initial opening volley. And I'll look forward to your thoughts and questions about where to take this, because I think it's a really critical issue for the public to understand.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think in our other podcast, we went into a lot of detail about iron. You went through all of my labs. So people who are not familiar with that, there's an excellent video on this. So I think just to summarize where we're at, you're saying that blood work is misread. And when there's low iron in the blood or low ferritin, it's automatically assumed, oh, that person's got anemia. And then it's the opposite when they see high copper in the blood. People say, oh, no, that's way too much. You've got copper toxicity. The other problem is this invisible copper toxicity that tends to be pulled out of HTMAs or hair tissue mineral analysis. So maybe if you want to talk about what are people reading in a HTMA to make this claim about invisible copper toxicity, because the word invisible copper toxicity tied into what you said is just another way to blame copper. So now it's invisible.
Right. No, it's a very, the phantom or the invisible. Absolutely. There are three sisters that allegedly run together. There's high copper, hidden high copper, high calcium, and high estrogen. Those are called the three sisters in the HTMA parlance. Have you ever heard that phrase before? The three sisters? Yeah. And so it took me years to kind of piece that apart, take it apart and say, what are they really talking about? When you get into the nuance of hair tissue mineral analysis, the first thing you have to understand is that the HTMA really shines with the interpretation or the representation of the electrolytes. Really solid. Calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. It has a good representation of phosphorus. But then we get to the metals. And the classical metals that they're going to highlight are going to be copper, zinc, iron, and manganese. And what most people don't know about the mechanism of doing HTMA analysis is the very first thing they do to a hair sample is they burn it. They oxidize it. What does that do? It freezes the oxidation state of the metal. So zinc only has one oxidation state, +2, has a +2 valence. Copper has two oxidation states, +1 and +2. But when you burn it, it freezes it to a +2. Then you've got iron, has 3 or 4, depending upon the author. There are at least 3 or 4 oxidation states for iron. Manganese has 5 or 6. But they all get frozen at +2 because they've been oxidized by the burning of the tissue. Well, that right out of the blocks seems to invalidate the metal side of the HTMA. And so then they make this grand declaration, oh, it's hidden copper toxicity because of the symptoms, right? Oh, turns out your estrogen is high. Turns out your calcium is high. Well, we just assume that your copper must be high in the tissue. And so as I began to piece that apart, it really comes back to iron. It's absolutely fascinating. So there's a cascade of mineral dysregulation that comes with stress. And this was originally developed by Dr. Fiedler in 1899. And when we're under stress, we lose magnesium. And so magnesium loss leads to electrolyte derangement. because magnesium is really important for regulating the electrolytes. When you have electrolyte derangement, you have energy loss. When you have energy loss, you have cell death. When you have cell death, it's followed by inflammation. And then inflammation is followed by fibrosis, or the calcification of the tissue. That was theorized by Dr. Fiedler in 1899. Pretty impressive what he knew back then. The part that he didn't know about or didn't connect the dots to is, what's the greatest stressor on planet Earth? Oh yeah, it's iron stress. We live on a planet where iron is the number one element. We live on a planet where oxygen is the second most reactive element after fluorine gas. And what do iron and oxygen like to do? Play with each other to create oxidative stress. And so oxidative stress is the trigger for the magnesium loss that no one ever accounted for. And so when there is high calcium, when one of those three sisters shows up in a hair test, and it's with what is typically called a slow oxidizer, high calcium, that's because of high iron that no one's aware of. And it's fascinating. There's just, and it won't always be represented by the iron in the hair test. It'll show up in a blood test, but it's not going to show up in a hair test. So iron is triggering this reaction for high calcium. Then we got to get to estrogen. So it turns out that estrogen is an antioxidant. It isn't just a hormone. It's an antioxidant hormone. And my theory is that all of the hormones, all the steroid hormones, are responding to the state of oxidative stress in the body. And the prevailing theory is that hormones run the body. I don't buy that. They react to the body. I'll buy that. And they're trying to move minerals to respond to what's going on. But what is established in the literature is that when the ceruloplasmin level is low and or the ferroxidase enzyme expression is low, estrogen rises. And estrogen rises because it's the antioxidant to make up for the loss of ferroxidase enzyme function. So there's the second sister. So we've got calcium's high, estrogen's high, and what's established in the literature is that estrogen will trigger copper release from ceruloplasmin. That's what's triggering when a woman gets pregnant. There's an explosion of copper in the serum. It's because there's an explosion of estrogen in the body. And the part that people don't know about is there actually are three multi-copper oxidases that the placenta expresses during the pregnancy. We have ceruloplasmin, we have hephaestin, and the one that no one's ever heard of, identified by Harry McArdle in 2008 in University of Aberdeen, is called cyclopen. So there's three multi-copper ferroxidases expressed in the womb. Nobody knows that. They don't test for it. And we're just supposed to, oh, wow, I need more iron. I need more vitamin D for my pregnancy. And they completely ignore magnesium, copper, and retinol, which are essential for healthy fetal brain development. A lot of literature on that. But nobody knows that. Let's just focus on the vitamin D and the iron. But the estrogen will trigger copper release from the ceruloplasmin. When were they really studying that extensively? Well, when they were developing the birth control pill in the 60s. At the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, they knew that the birth control pill was going to blow up ceruloplasmin and cause copper to be released, which is going to totally mess up the copper-iron axis in the body. And so there's the third sister. We have iron really driving the calcium rise, the estrogen rise, and then the subsequent copper rise. And so the mainstream practitioners who do hair tissue mineral analysis will defer to those three sisters, but they won't know that it's the copper that isn't regulating the iron as it should, as the body is designed to regulate that iron to prevent rising oxidative stress, to prevent the symptoms that cause people to come to their doctor, in large part because there's just no open awareness about that. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I think the crux of this is that they're leaving iron out of the three sisters, and like you said before, the symptoms of iron overload are pretty serious, and it's very oxidative, and
Right.
and also the way in which a HTMA sample is prepared. You're saying it's good for some minerals or elements, and then it's weak for others. Because I think something else we were planning on discussing is that HTMAs are very old, and no disrespect to Eck and I think Watson, but the way in which they were interpreted back then, things have changed a lot now, and you can't just fix HTMAs with the general supplements that people just keep prescribing. So just to sort of sum up, what would you say a HTMA is good at, and can you pull out copper deficiency from a HTMA analysis?
Well, great question. Great follow-on question. The HTMA, my mentor was Rick Moulter, great guy, love him to death, brilliant hair tissue mineral practitioner. He taught me that the hair test was good for two things. And I think he's absolutely right. And it stood the test of time. He said, you can tell right away when you look at and there's a refinement that Rick did with the reporting of the information. He developed what's called the Malter mix. And what it does is it normalizes the results to what would be ideal. And you can very quickly see whether this person's calcium or their potassium or whatever it happens to be. But what Rick did was he created this Malter mix, normalized the results, and then you can tell when you see the results run through the Malter mix, you can tell in a nanosecond whether this person's under stress or not. Most important question, is this client that I'm meeting with under stress? And when you know that they have stress in their world, you know they have oxidative stress in their body, because that's just the way the system works. It's really, really powerful. And so when the bars that show up on the hair test are above and below the ideal, as they always are, you know you're dealing with someone who's under stress. Now, I've done over 7,500 hair tests, and I've had one perfect hair result. One perfect. It was amazing. What's fascinating is the client was 95 years old, and it was a woman who was actually visiting her daughter in the Chicago area. She lived out in North Dakota, as I recall. And she still wore 2-inch spike heels. She's 95 years. She's not wearing nun heels. She's wearing spike heels. And she had more energy than I'd seen in most people. And I begged her to do a hair test. And finally, when I said, look, I'll do it for free. And she said, okay, you're on, young man. And so I sent the results to Rick Moulter. He said, Morley, this is the best hair test I've ever seen. He was fascinated by it. And so she lived on a farm with well water, but she ate really good food. And she had more energy than her 70-year-old daughter. And it was a fascinating situation. The point being, that's the first test is this person dealing with stress? That 95-year-old woman had very little stress in her system. The second insight that you get from the hair test is there's a way to identify what's called the adrenal ratio and the thyroid ratio to identify, is this person able to make energy in the face of their stress? Now, what I did was, I call it Morley math. I multiply those two ratios against themselves to see, are they able to generate energy? And most oftentimes they're not. And that's really part of the stimulus for the book, Cure Your Fatigue, because people are so stressed out they can't make energy. And that's what brings them to the doctor. But the
So,
point is that I think,
with
go
the
ahead.
Morley ratio, so which ratios do you multiply together and what number should come out?
So the Morley ratio is the adrenal ratio, which is sodium to magnesium, times the thyroid ratio, which is calcium to potassium. And then what I'm looking for is a positive number that shows that they can, in fact, generate energy. It's the hair tissue labs, especially TEI and I think ARL, they will generate those ratios. So it's a pretty easy number to come out with. But it's just useful to know whether the person is able to produce optimal levels of energy. But back to your original question, is the hair test good for measuring copper? No, it's not. Because copper expresses through its protein ceruloplasmin. And you can't measure ceruloplasmin in the hair test, which is why I turn to the blood test to begin to dig deeper into the dynamics of iron metabolism, the dynamics of copper metabolism, zinc, get the magnesium in the red blood cell, begin to look at vitamin A, vitamin D, and begin to build a much more robust understanding of what's happening to the key minerals. But you can't measure ceruloplasmin, which is the obligate protein to say, does it have any capacity to support the antioxidant function in the body? The limitation, the one key limitation is, again, we're back to the Swiss Army knife. They'll tell us how many of these proteins we've got, but they won't tell us about the functionality of the protein. And that's where we are at a disadvantage. I think there are only a handful of countries in the world that will allow full ferroxidase functioning of the blood work. Turkey and India, Iceland, there are a couple others, but it's a very short list of countries that will give a pass to the practitioners to look at that.
Yeah, I just want to tie this up by asking about zinc because in the HTMA, because a lot of people take zinc supplements, I always see a low copper zinc ratio, and I know they're taking supplements and their ceruloplasmin's low. What have you got to say about zinc blood levels? Because is there any caveats there? Because you said that with zinc, when you heat it up, it's only got one oxidation state. So can you pull out information about zinc overloading from a HTMA and a blood test? Because it's kind of common.
Yeah. So zinc is a very popular supplement, as you know. It was part of the COVID cocktail. So we had high dose ascorbic acid, high dose vitamin D, and high dose zinc. That's the perfect triad to kill copper metabolism in the human body. People need to know that. Zinc shows the best of the metals on the hair test because of its natural oxidation state is +2. It will always be near the ideal. It's very rare to see zinc either be really low or really high. If there's some distortion of zinc, it's usually because of the shampoo they're using. There's certain shampoos that will throw off the zinc component. What's important for people to understand, and again, I've only seen it in one article, but it's published, it's been peer reviewed. But there are a lot of enzymes that need to be expressed in the liver. Some say it's as much as 500 enzymes. Many of them require magnesium. Magnesium really is the go-to mineral for liver activity, and it's +2. Magnesium is +2. Zinc is +2. So what happens? Well, the standard Western diet is very low in copper. When you have low copper in your diet, your iron level in your liver is going to be very high. That was established in 1928 by two separate independent studies March and May of 1928, University of Wisconsin, University of Kentucky. And it's important to know that copper has been an established, copper deficiency has been the number one nutrient deficiency on the farm for at least 60 years. So we're pretty confident that copper is going to be low in the food system, which means iron is going to be high in the liver for the two-legged rats. And so when iron is high in the liver, it's going to create oxidative stress. It's just a natural mechanism of the liver. And where there's a lot of oxidative stress, who takes it on the chin? Magnesium. It's the first mineral to go to stress. Magnesium and B vitamins. And so if magnesium is low, it only makes sense that the ability to make vitamin D is going to go down, because the enzyme to make vitamin D, storage D, is 25-hydroxylase, which is magnesium dependent. So, but the liver's pretty smart. And again, this was chronicled in an article where when magnesium is low, the liver knows to use zinc as a surrogate. So when the liver starts to consume zinc out of the blood, what happens to zinc levels in the blood? They start to go down. And the common mistake that's made by practitioners the world over is to see a low zinc and say, oh, you need to supplement with zinc. Because they're not familiar with the 15 years of research by George Brewer, who proved that zinc is a perfect inhibitor of copper uptake in the body. Zinc kills the ferroxidase function of ceruloplasmin. Zinc will inhibit cytochrome C oxidase in complex 4 of the mitochondria. I don't know. Those are 3 really powerful reasons why you should never take zinc supplements. And I think the form that's in the bottle has been weaponized as opposed to what you get in food. I don't think they're the same potency, but that's one of the reasons why within the root cause protocol, we encourage people to not take zinc supplements, because it's going to disrupt copper metabolism. And again, George Brewer established beyond a shadow of a doubt that zinc will inhibit copper uptake. That's a serious infraction in our nutrient uptake. And people aren't aware of that, but it fits the narrative. Oh, I don't want to be copper toxic, so then I'll take zinc so that I don't have to worry about the copper. And that's the inversion thinking that runs the planet right now. People are upside down and backwards, and they don't realize that zinc is in fact working against them. And they've built the argument about how zinc will kill the replication of the virus, right? Everyone knows that now. But what they've never been told is that, well, actually, copper will kill the virus, will kill any pathogen, will kill the parasite, will kill the bacteria and the fungus. That's its job. It's the master antioxidant on the planet, and it's the master inhibitor of pathogenic growth. But we're not supposed to know that. And who's the master pro-oxidant? Iron. Who regulates iron? Oh yeah, it's copper. Copper's the general. Iron is the foot soldier. But people don't know it that straightforwardly. So I think zinc is a very problematic nutrient that people don't understand the full nature of its properties, and they've been seduced into thinking that Carl Pfeiffer, back in the 60s, talking about the zinc-copper ratio, that was valid science. No one in the 30s, 40s, or 50s even bothered to think about zinc. The focus was on copper and iron because the focus was on making energy in the mitochondria. And zinc has no involvement in making energy in the mitochondria. Absolutely none. And I think that's worthy of mention. And neither does vitamin D. Vitamin A is in fact involved in electron movement between complex 3 and 4 in the signaling zone. Vitamin D, MIA, has no involvement in energy production that I know of. I can't wait to be corrected if I'm misinterpreting it, and neither does zinc. And so there's this complete misunderstanding about why we need more zinc and stay away from copper. And we work overtime to try to correct that confusion.
If somebody had a zinc overload, what kind of symptoms would they get?
Great. That's a great question. I don't know that I've got that committed to memory. I think I guess if they have a zinc overload, what I would suspect is they are going to have classical signs of copper deficiency. They are going to have fatigue. They are going to have, you're probably going to have hair loss. They're going to have, they may have signs of melanin disruption in their body. You begin to think about the different metabolic pathways that are run by copper that most people don't know about. If you have a zinc overload, you're going to begin to work against it. And an area where people get very exercised and very agitated is around cryptopyrroles. And that the cryptopyrrole, or the pyroluria, as it's called, is causing zinc loss and B6 loss. Well, let's back up a step. Let's get back to the ferrochelatase enzyme, which is the last enzyme to make heme. It's a copper-dependent enzyme. And what is ferrochelatase? It's a crane operator being run by copper, and it drops the iron ball into the center of the heme molecule. Well, if ferrochelatase isn't working right because copper's not working right, then you are going to get a cryptopyrrole, and that will disrupt zinc and B6 metabolism. But don't correct it with zinc and B6. Why don't you correct the copper problem causing the ferrochelatase dysfunction? And so I think there's a lot of disjointed thinking about how to solve these problems.
Just before we finish on the HTMA and copper, is there any link between manganese and chromium and copper? Because a lot of people don't know very much about manganese, and it's a very Goldilocksy mineral. You have to get the amount just right because it can definitely be toxic in excess. And then there are situations where, with certain ways of eating, where people might not get enough manganese. Is there anything you have to say on manganese, chromium, and copper? Because everything's connected often with the minerals.
Yeah. Well, orders of magnitude. I think is it 25,000 milligrams of magnesium? It's 5,000 plus milligrams of iron. It's 100 milligrams of copper in our body, ideally. Manganese, 10 milligrams. I mean, we're talking about ridiculously small amounts of manganese. I would never supplement with manganese. I would find foods that historically might have had it. But I think there's from my perspective, the prevailing perspective is that there's somewhere between 82 and 92 minerals on the planet, depending upon where you might be surveying it, whether it's soil or sea, whatever. But the perception is they're all of equal value. I don't believe that. They are a hierarchy, and I'm convinced that copper is at the very top. You begin to look at the oxidase enzymes, the enzymes that are able to metabolize oxygen, harness that oxygen, make full use of the energy of the oxygen. They're all copper dependent. And so I think there's been this distortion of, they're all the same, so I need as much manganese as I need copper. It's like, no, you don't. And there's great case studies of grazing animals who get grass staggers because of the whole change in mineral composition of the grass from winter to spring. I think the grass staggers probably has more to do with molybdenum than manganese. But the point is, I think there's this distortion of needing something when in fact, I think there are only certain nutrients that we need to regularly replace, like the copper, the magnesium, the B vitamins, things of that nature, the retinol, and through the cod liver oil, the vitamin D as well. But I think the other side of it, chromium, again, the whole concept of glucose intolerance. That's what chromium is all about. You need more chromium to keep your glucose regulated. I was in that camp until I read Leslie Clavet's, I think it was 1987 article about copper deficiency in 3 men, and they all had sugar problems. And what he was trying to blow up was this perception that chromium was the glucose intolerance factor. And what he referred to was a 1980 textbook on pediatric medicine, a recognized textbook. I don't have it committed to memory, where the statement in the textbook on Menkes disease said that children with Menkes disease are the most glucose intolerant people on planet Earth. Well, Menkes is all about copper. Has nothing to do with chromium. And so I think this notion that chromium is the glucose intolerance factor is just another wink, wink, let me distort your understanding of the truth, when in fact, what I came across recently in an article by Earl Frieden from 1971 is that, much to my surprise, copper is critical for the glucose transporter 2 to function properly. Now, GLUT2 is not the most dominant form of glucose transport, but I think it begins to herald in a different perspective, because when I read Robert Lustig's book, Fat Chance, which was published in 2013, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I would encourage your followers to read it. Most people have a function called Audible, and my Audible is Dr. Liz, and we were driving somewhere, and she's reading Fat Chance. She gets to this passage, and I almost had an accident when she said it. Thank God I didn't. But he made a comment. He was referring, again, the book is time frame 2013, referring back to the early 80s. He said, it requires twice as much insulin today to remove the same amount of glucose it did 30 years ago. Twice as much insulin. Well, what happened in the early 80s? Oh, yeah, they introduced glyphosate. And what does glyphosate do? Well, it's a perfect copper chelate. And so I think we have more smoking guns than clinical proof, but I think there's enough evidence that there's a relationship between copper and sugar and glucose tolerance versus having to bring in the big guns of insulin to solve the problem. And I think the other side of it is insulin as a signaling peptide requires the PAM enzyme. And what does the PAM enzyme require? Got to have copper to run the PAM enzyme. So I think there's a lot of evidence that the glucose intolerance factor could be far more foundational around copper than what we're led to believe with chromium. And I think the issue with manganese is, I think it's a very tricky substance. We need very little of it. And what I find in people who have their source of water is a well, the well water tends to be very high in iron and manganese. And those are the metals that really drive a swamp. And so when you're drinking or relying on well water, it's not uncommon for your blood to become more swamp-like and become more infested with toxins and problems. So I think manganese is it's a legitimate mineral, but I don't think it's on the same scale as magnesium or copper by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I looked at a HTMA the other day, and somebody had what looked like slightly low manganese. So the practitioner had put them on something like 5 milligram supplement. So I just said, that's just crazy. But I think what you've highlighted is that manganese is it has its role, but we just leave it alone. Just to finish off on copper, what are your thoughts on monoatomic copper? Because monoatomics have totally different properties to the original version. And I'm very interested in monoatomic gold and platinum and palladium, but then there's a big following of monoatomic copper. It doesn't matter if it's not your thing. And then you can tell me all of the new stuff that you've been learning. I just wanted to wrap up just on that. So we've covered pretty much every angle of copper.
I don't really know that much about monatomic metals. I haven't studied enough. And I'm just going to have to profess ignorance that I do know enough to know that their properties are different, but I'm not sure what the striking differences are. I'm kind of old-fashioned. Let's get our minerals the way our ancestors did. And I don't know that we know the full ramifications of what we're doing by creating nanoparticles and things of that nature. I get a little nervous when I'm reading studies where they're relying on that type of intervention. So I'd have to be very cautious about it, but I just don't know that much one way or the other.
Oh, no, that's fine. I just thought I'd throw that in there because it doesn't matter, because I respect you for saying I don't know. And also, I think it's a very good point that if people are making these unusual forms of elements, because sure, just because monoatomic gold and monoatomic hydrogen are really interesting, it doesn't mean monoatomic everything else is going to be something beneficial. So also you said, because we actually talked last year, I think, and you said in the meantime you've discovered all of these new things. So for the last part, do you want to take the stage and tell us what you've learned?
Yeah, let's just run through a little potpourri of discoveries.
I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free, valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes, and use code Dr. Sara for a discount off your order.
I think what's important for people to know is that iron recycling is really, really important in the body. We know about blood circulation, but we never stop and think about the need for recycling the iron that goes in the blood. So it was in the late 1500s that William Harvey was able to connect the dots between arteries and veins. And what I was just reading about today is that disrupted 1,500 years of Galen's teachings. That's a long time. A lot of practitioners relied on Galen for that, when in fact they had a misunderstanding. I think there's an equally great misunderstanding about iron recycling. There's actually iron recycling at a mitochondrial level, at a cellular level, and at a body level. And what I've come across recently is the work of Dr. Hussein at Northwestern University Medical Center, who's published a lot of articles on the ABC transporters that are very involved in iron recycling, especially in heart tissue. But there's a particular membrane transporter called ABCB8. And it's the mechanism that makes sure that iron gets out of the mitochondria to get back into the cell, so it can be part of the process of recycling iron to get back into the system. If it can't get out of the mitochondria, you got a problem. And so we are trained, like circus bears, to believe that the mitochondria are powerhouses. They're not powerhouses. They're smithies. The mitochondria are working with iron. They're doing a lot of things. They're breaking down amino acids. They're working with calcium. I'm very aware of the diversity of activity. But probably the most important thing they're doing is recycling iron. And in the same way that a Ford motor plant is building cars, doing stuff to make the car work, it has an energy supply system that it relies on to get that work done. And that's really what the mitochondrial complexes are about, providing the energy to recycle the iron so that it doesn't accumulate in the mitochondria to kill the energy production. And if you don't know about ABCB7, ABCB8, ABCB10, then you don't understand how the iron needs to be recycled, especially for iron sulfur clusters and for heme. Critically important mechanisms that are taking place inside the mitochondria. And what's also related to this is a protein I'd never heard of. It's called ALR. It's in the human form, it's called the augmenter of liver regeneration. Its yeast counterpart it's absolutely fascinating. It's called ERVP1, essential for vitality and respiration 1. Those are pretty powerful words. Essential for respiration and vitality. And so those proteins, what a coincidence. They're copper dependent. What a surprise. And so nobody talks about ALR or EVRP1. And I think that's a crying shame. And then, but the whole notion of the mitochondria as a smithy is fascinating to think about. As an iron recycling center, makes so much sense when you think about it. The work of Earl Frieden that I mentioned earlier from 1971, but a nuance to that work, which I think is really important to bring up to people, is that, again, this is 1971, so we're 50 years ago. He was 54 years ago. Very insightful guy. But he did an experiment with animals as it related to the ferroxidase enzyme that we're not supposed to know about, that we're not supposed to test for. And what he made some very bold assertions, which he had a track record of integrity that was impeccable. But he said that the iron recycling system will work just fine with a 10% capacity in the ferroxidase enzyme. 10% of ideal. It'll still be fine. And he said the iron recycling system will still work even at a 1% functional capacity. But then he went on to say that what he discovered in the research that he did with animals is that after 7 days of no ferroxidase enzyme function, no function at all, that's when anemia would appear in the animal, in the blood. So when you think about the fact that according to the World Health Organization, what's the number one nutrient deficiency on planet Earth? Why, it's iron deficiency. It's the number one, and it has been since, I think, the early 2000s. The latest research, I think, was 2020. But the point is, well, anemia is not a lack of iron. It's a lack of ferroxidase enzyme function, and we're not allowed to measure. And then, just to round out the discoveries with what I learned this morning, people always want to know, what'd you learn today, Morley? Well, this is a blockbuster. There's three forms of low iron. So we have low hemoglobin, we have low ferritin, and we have low serum iron. And what people need to know is that hemoglobin is a bucket. 80% of the iron is tied up in hemoglobin and myoglobin, small percentage, but the bucket of iron in the body is hemoglobin. The teacup, which you're quite familiar with as a Brit, much smaller than a bucket, right? And so that's about 10% of the iron is tied up in ferritin. 10%. And the ferritin is supposed to be inside the cell. It's not supposed to be showing up in the blood. That's the work of Orozio and Harrison and some really big names in hematology. It's not me, Douglas Kell, people of that stature. Ferritin is not supposed to be in the blood. Ideal ferritin for a human being is 0, according to Douglas Kell. But that's a very disruptive statistic. And then the third form of low iron is low serum iron. And that's a thimble of iron that represents less than 1% of the iron in the body. Hemoglobin and low serum iron, they're really easy to explain. Incredibly easy. When we get to ferritin, our sphincters start to tighten up. It's very easy to explain high ferritin. There's basically an inflammatory breakdown in the liver. And the part that's really important for people to understand is that there's a process called ferritinophagy. It's the recycling of ferritin. It's the autophagy of ferritin. And when that gets overstimulated, you're going to have this excessive expression of ferritin in the bloodstream. But the ferritin that's showing up, it's the ferritin light chain, missing 10 amino acids, but it's going to show up in the blood as ferritin, even though it's empty shotgun shells. There's no iron in that blood. But that's what everyone keys off of. Oh, you have healthy ferritin in your blood. But the great enigma was low ferritin. How do you explain low ferritin? And a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with Dr. Douglas Kell, who I'll be chatting with in a few weeks in London. And I said, Dr. Kell, I have this theory that low ferritin is met with high hepcidin. Without batting an eye, he said, you're absolutely right. So let's tease that
Sorry,
apart.
what was that? Low ferritin was paired with high
hepcidin. High hepcidin, which is the iron hormone, which is a very confusing metabolite, but we're not allowed to measure it in the blood. We can measure it in the urine, but we can't measure it in the blood. Excuse me? If we can measure transferrin, if we can measure ceruloplasmin, we need to measure hepcidin because it would be part of that whole network of communicating within the blood what's going on. But the breakthrough today was to discover that when I've theorized, I've not been able to prove it, but I've theorized through client work and through case studies and what have you, that when someone has low ferritin, they typically have parasites. So parasites are a pathogen. And what is hepcidin's job? Well, it's made by the HAMP gene, HAMP, which stands for hepatic antimicrobial peptide. So hepcidin is rising to protect against the fact that iron is not being recycled properly, and we got to deal with the pathogens. And lo and behold, what I found today was 2 studies that prove that when hepcidin rises, ferritinophagy stops. there's no recycling of ferritin. Therefore, it would not show up in the blood. Ferritin would not spill over into the blood. And the misperception by practitioners the world over is that low ferritin means you have low stored iron and you need an iron supplement or maybe even an iron infusion. And it's absolutely false, because what's driving ferritinophagy? Oh yeah, copper. If we don't have copper, we can't have effective ferritinophagy, because the transporter NCOA4, which is the shuttle that moves ferritin into the lysosome, needs to dock with the ferritin heavy chain as part of the ferritin molecule. And what does hepcidin do? It severs that docking so that the NCOA4 cannot move the ferritin into the lysosome. And so there's a very clear mechanistic reason why ferritin gets low, but has nothing to do with iron and everything to do with bioavailable copper. And I think it's worth tooting our horn about that, because the public is being poisoned with iron when they have low ferritin, because practitioners have not been taught a complete understanding about the recycling of iron and the importance of understanding the different markers for iron, whether it's hemoglobin, ferritin, or serum iron.
Yes, so just to reiterate that, to tie it back to the beginning. So you mentioned something right at the beginning about copper killing, we'll just call it invaders of the body. And then you said that sometimes low ferritin can be an example of invaders. So it all comes back to copper again, of why the invaders were there in the first place. Then
Exactly.
very important thing you said was, can you list them again, of the things that we're not allowed to measure that would blow this stupid iron straw man apart? Because that's now, we talked about this invisible or hidden copper toxicity problem, like a word to try and frame copper. And now there's tests we're not allowed to run that's going to hide the iron overload and the copper deficiency problem.
Again, I think it would be really important for people to know, again, the one part of the ceruloplasmin protein that let us know about, not measure, but know about, is ferroxidase. But it's treated as though it's the only enzyme function in ceruloplasmin, when in fact it's one of, I would say, dozens. It might be as much as 30 different functions. Ceruloplasms, the substrates that work with ceruloplasmin are iron, copper, manganese that we were talking about earlier, oxygen, phenol groups, diphenol groups, all the catecholamines can interact with ceruloplasmin. You begin to get into the bowels of ceruloplasmin function. It's like, oh my gosh, and we're not supposed to know anything about that. And so the lack of ferroxidase function testing is a critical defect. The inability to know about hepcidin in the blood. We can know about ceruloplasmin and transferrin, and that's the 1-2 mechanism for regulating iron in the body. Well, hepcidin is a third player. We need to know where hepcidin is in that process. We're not supposed to know about the functionality of superoxide dismutase, maybe one of the most important antioxidant enzymes in our body, that's expressed through ceruloplasmin, I might add, but it has its own separate enzyme capacity as well as SOD1 and SOD3. And so we're handicapped in the world of clinical medicine and alternative healing, because we are prohibited from knowing the real intelligence of the copper metabolism and the copper iron dynamic, because we are restricted on the testing. And I think I'm not trying to boil the ocean. I'm not trying to change medicine overnight. I think it comes down to a matter of choice. If there are people who want to take the time to learn what you and I know about the mitochondria and how metabolism really works, we should be able to access the testing to find out, hey, how's it working in my body? Don't tell me that every problem I have requires iron. I know that that's not true. And so that we need to be able to give people the knowledge if they want to take the time to learn it, and then if they want to take the responsibility to exercise that right, to say, no, I want to take this path, not that path. I think that is, to me, that's the most progressive way to approach the problems that we've got. And I think worldwide, we're in a whale of hurt as you begin to assemble what's taking place. And it's like, I think we need to empower people like yourself, like myself and others, to innovate and find where's the cutting edge of reversing this insanity so that we can bring the body back to its natural state of balance. Because what I firmly believe, Sara, based on our prior conversations, there is an innate intelligence in our body. And I would argue that it's built around the bioavailability of copper. There are other practitioners who might take issue with that. But the evidence is overwhelming when you begin to look at the power of copper in the mitochondria, the power of copper with hormone signaling, the power of copper to regulate iron and oxygen and all these other substrates. I just think we need to embrace that dimension of physiology that's been suppressed for a century or more. And I think it's time to begin to come into a more enlightened point of view about how the body can actually protect itself and defend itself and keep itself in balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think last time we talked about how you can measure the amount of ceruloplasmin, but because it's got so many functions, what you're saying is we're not allowed to measure its intelligence or its functionality. So a ceruloplasmin test unfortunately, it's very useful and lots of people don't get it, but there's still a much deeper layer of how functional is this ceruloplasmin. Then the next thing I just want to point out, because I just know the kind of things people ask, eating red meat has got nothing to do with what we're talking about with iron overload. And then I just want to add in about something that happened, like that people say to me kind of reasonably regularly. There was a person going on to me about their low ferritin, and I looked at everything for them, and it was clearly other problems than low copper. And then I got a message back saying, oh, my practitioner's put me on iron supplements. And this is a thing that really gets on my nerves. It's like people have got to learn, you're not a sheep, you're not a muppet. You've got to learn, listen. I sent her to watch our videos, and still after like watching them, it was still, oh yeah, my practitioner's put me on iron. And I think that's a cop out also to then blame somebody else later when their symptoms get worse, because I'm just as angry about all this iron nonsense as you are. So I've been beating the iron drum as well. And I'm sure there are other practitioners or people someone's come back to them and said, oh, somebody put me on this. It's like, you're not allowed to do this to people. You can't just put them on these nasty, horrible, you might as well drink rusty water. So I think what we've been talking about is really important. And even though this is our fourth iteration, you've kind of said it in a different way. And also I've got more forceful over it because I've had a whole year to digest and pass on your work. And then what you just told me about the mitochondria being a smithery and being playing a role in iron trafficking and recycling has blown my mind, because again, it comes back to, if your mitochondria are healthy, it's another tool into dealing with this iron problem. So that's just my closing comment to try and tie up in a sort of simple way what we've been talking about. But I am correct that we're held back in that we're not allowed to examine the different functionalities of the ceruloplasmin, but we're allowed to know how much of it we have. And even then, I have to demand people get that test.
Exactly. And again, the example that I use. So how tall are you? What's your height?
What, me? 5'6".
5'6". So I'm 6 foot. So my height is 6 inches higher than your height. And what they want us to believe is that because I'm 6 inches higher, that means my IQ is more than yours. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. I really wouldn't want to get into an intellectual debate with you, given your training and research skill. But the point is, that's the difference between ceruloplasmin level, which is height, and IQ, which is intelligence. We are barred from knowing the intelligence side of the equation. That's got to stop. That those days are over. And the other part that I just wanted to reinforce that you were talking about with the heme versus the non-heme, that was probably that's how my fall really unfolded last year, was learning that there's a difference between heme iron and non-heme iron, and the transporters and the mechanistic pathways to process heme iron versus non-heme iron completely different. I did not know that. And so what's the most efficient form of iron? Animal protein, because it's already in the state that the body can work with it. And so all of this foment about non-heme iron coming from supplement bottles, coming through a dietary system, which is only 5% of the iron that we need each day, and ignoring the 95% coming from a recycling system that's already got the iron in the state that it needs to be in. That's where the gross distortion is in physiology, not knowing that those two systems, there's dietary and recycled iron, heme and non-heme iron, and it's like, oh my gosh. And they intersect in very powerful ways. And the public doesn't know that, and the practitioners don't know that. And so that's where I think these types of conversations are so important, to give people a real clear understanding that it isn't that complicated, but we're being restricted about what we can learn to really take control. I mean, our goal is we want our clients and people who follow the RCP to be the CEO of their health. You should be able to take control. You should be able to get the knowledge you need, make decisions. And if you want to work with a practitioner, that's fine. But you should have the latitude and the liberty to be able to make those decisions and do the right kind of testing. So it's just a different way to approach it.
Yeah, just so we can finish off. But the thing about the root cause protocol, and you've researched everything in tiny detail, that the people who I'm talking about who just put people on these iron chemicals don't know anything because they've never taken the time to learn. And I've just got more impatient in my old age because there's so much information out there, and people should just learn to study, because I've been wrong loads of times. Like I learn more by making massive mistakes, and then I keep learning, and then I keep seeing common denominators. Then I can see through the BS quicker, because it's just an iterative cycle. And you're the same. Like every time I speak to you, it's like, oh yeah, I learned this morning, and you know, I do know how old you are, and it's something you just never stop learning, and there's no excuse for people to not try. And with your book, I think it's a great book, but people will sometimes think, oh, it's a bit too hard. It's like, it's not hard at all. It's a foundational understanding of a really important topic. So I just wanted to end on that. People probably think I'm in a bad mood. I'm not. I just think iron overload's really dangerous, and people blame cholesterol and this, that, and the other for heart attacks. I hear all sorts of other things on a daily basis. And also the biggest provider of iron from food can be grains and bread. So it's like the bun, not the burger. But you covered that very well in our first podcast, because that's a whole other story. So I just want to thank you so much again for coming back on the podcast. And when you come to the UK and we meet up, we might even do a Sara and Morley in person, because already there's so much more that we could talk about, because, you know, you never stop learning and putting pieces of the jigsaw together.
No, and I think what I've done, and I appreciate your comments, what I've done is tried to deepen our understanding of how intelligent Mother Nature really is. It's incredible what our natural design is and what it can tolerate. And there's a lot of the confusion, largely because they changed the food system. We didn't know the number of changes they made to food, changes they made in farming that affected the food. And I think that's where people need to begin to really embrace that shift so they can understand what we're really talking about here. So I appreciate the opportunity to do it.
So anyway, yeah, thank you very much once again, Morley. It's been really fun talking to you, and I'm sure we'll continue doing this for a long time.
Well, as long as I'm standing, I would look forward to that. So I can't wait to have the next conversation.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. I've really enjoyed learning from Morley, and there might be a possibility that he'll come back in a while with part 5, because he's always learning new things, and I always get plenty of value from what he teaches me and talks about. If you're interested in learning more about quantum biology, I've got an affordable $19 course that covers the basics of water, light, magnetism, nutrition, the quantum starter kit, mitochondria and energy from the ground up. So check out the link in the description, and thanks for watching.